can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to Veronica.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Veronica Schmidt, and thank you, Carol, for such an amazing introduction. I am so privileged today to be doing my first webcast for SANS, and it's one that is literally near and dear to my heart. It is the thing that keeps me at such an energizer bunny as what I normally am. So let's get started. So who am I? Well, I'm an assistant professor at the moment for DFIR at North University in Norway. Even though I haven't geographically moved yet, I'm also a director at DFIR Labs in South Africa, although not an active one at the moment. But I'm also a security engineer within Medtronic. And this has been a position that I've been taking on for the last year. And this is probably where I've learned so much about the device that keeps my heart beating. I'm also an instructor there for SANS for 4500, which is an amazing course. I'm also a cyborg. Now, some of you might wonder why. Well, I have a little device that shocks me every so often when my heart misbehaves, as well as paces it when it is unable to do so. I'm a researcher and a hacker. The most important thing here is how to find me and what my passions are. So let's dive into this. I'm often asked, why is medical devices so important? Well, if we consider that someone, at least that we know, has either got a remote monitor, a wearable, or even just a pacemaker or an ICD, these devices are life important for some people. Now I'm going to tell you guys two stories that are very personal to myself. And yes, these are stories about me. At the age of 19, I was diagnosed with a very rare heart condition for someone of that age. I had a third-degree heart block. This effectively meant that my heart would periodically stop and be unable to recover and sustain consciousness. I had to get a pacemaker and an ICD to deal with that problem. Here comes in the complication. The medical aid or the medical insurance that I had in South Africa was unable to pay for this. My parents were not in the position to be able to pay for this. And I went home to die at the age of 19 with 2 weeks left to live. Yeah, some people might find that hard to understand, but there comes a point where you are too tired to fight, too tired to breathe, and too tired to try. Luckily for me, I'm here today because Medtronic sponsored my first pacemaker and ICD. They basically gave me the opportunity to be here today to talk about what I did. It hasn't all been perfect and moonshine and roses. We had a turbulent start after we had our introduction. But fast forward a couple of years, November, December, things went horribly wrong. I came to the realization that medical devices fail, might break. Something might go wrong that stops your device from working. And it's at this point that you start mistrusting the device that it's in your chest beating your heart. As a patient, we place so much trust in our medical devices to keep us going. These devices aren't built to malfunction or fail. However, they are technologies. At this point, November, December, I was convinced intuitively that my device was not working. I was suffering from similar events as I had at the age of 19. This led to me being resuscitated twice, successfully, luckily, and me going on a fault-finding mission. Being a forensicator certainly saved my life in this. As you can see, there is an EKG which shows a very abnormal heart rhythm, which should not be the case if my device was working correctly. But what we also all missed was the fact that my device leads were measuring differently. Medical doctors tend to, when a patient comes to them, look for a medical reason why they are feeling a specific way, why they are having certain reactions or certain problems. Rarely is it ever a device problem or a technical difficulty. It is always either there's a medical reason or perhaps it's a psychological reason. I went through approximately 3 different cardiologists before I found one that was willing to listen to my approach and basically take a chance on saving my life. So, my question to you that I want you all to consider, and this is something I did not have an answer to at the time, how am I going to determine whether my device is working or not? Well, this is a question for the medical technologist because I had some intimate knowledge with devices, but I didn't know how to go on a fault finding mission to be in a position to, prove with data that my device was not working. All that I had at this point of time was the fact that I was fainting constantly, that my heart rate was out of control, and that I had no lease on life. I was tired. I was not me. And quality of life for a patient is such an important thing. When you lose that little spark, I can't describe it to anyone. It is traumatic. It is disappointing because there's so much you want to do, but you simply don't have the energy. So we started looking in what we can do. And due to my work within Medtronic, they explained to me what is called medical device debugging or engineering. And I thought to myself, well, okay, so let's see if I can debug the device, see if I can figure out where the problem lies. Because it's one thing saying to a medical practitioner that the device is faulty, but it's another thing pinpointing exactly what is wrong. So I thought to myself, well, medical device forensics is something I feel should exist, but it doesn't exist yet. And the process that I'm going to be explaining to you is kind of how my head worked in trying to find the best way to approach a real life case. The case of my health declining and my device no longer functioning. So the definition that I found for medical device debugging or engineering is to determine the source of a systematic error and correct it. It's fault finding. It's something that developers do when they are building code or building software. They try and problem solve. Well, for forensics, this is something we do often. How am I going to find the evidence? How am I going to find the needle in a haystack, the smoking gun? So it was nothing foreign for me. It was literally something that I was doing for 12 years. So we decided to debug my device. The question was, how do we do that? Well, with digital forensics, of course, we had to start doing data analysis. For me, data forensics is always to determine a sequence of events. It's preservation, identification, extraction, and documentation of computer evidence. The data contained on my device was nothing more than data evidence, data artifacts. But I had to figure out how to get to that data, how to preserve the data, identify what I need, extract it, and document my findings for my doctor. This is also nothing new. So I now knew that I had to use the process of debugging the device to access the data contained on it. And then I had to do digital forensics so that I can reconstruct the timeline that was happening. But more so, I needed to determine what the clinical reaction was or what the clinical effect was of the data that I was seeing. I needed to correlate all of this into a narrative, into a story, into something that I can show the doctor on black and white that shows that there's a problem with the device, the data and the timeline that has been happening, and what the medical clinical effects of that was on me. So far, I kind of didn't have a plan and things were just evolving as they were. Then I realized for me to be able to do the clinical effects, I had to go back to something that a coroner does or a medical examiner, medical forensics. So we needed to look at my medical history, my clinical, how I clinically looked, and we needed to determine what the causes of that was. We needed to correlate all the data sources into a single point of findings to determine what the device was doing, what the data was showing us the device was doing, and how I was clinically responding. What most people do not realize is every person reacts to an ICD shock or a pacing event differently. Some people genuinely have the ability to feel when their heart is being paced. They are aware of when an ICD triggers. Some people don't feel it. I was one of those patients that were very sensitive to the way that my device reacts to my treatment. And just to explain how these ICDs work, it's specifically when my heart would race to high levels due to the complex situation that I have medically, it would then bring it back into a normal sinus rhythm. But then I had the opposing thing where my heart rate would just slow down to almost non-existent and stop. That wouldn't be solved by an ICD necessarily. I needed something that paced it and would keep it beating and return it to a good beating heart rate. So I knew exactly what was happening because intuitively there's responses in my body that I as the patient know. Although no medical practitioner at this point still believed me. So what do we do to solve the conundrum that is medical device forensics? Well, there is not just one approach. There is not just one thing. It is a hybrid version. It's a multidisciplinary approach. I couldn't find in all my research one that I felt conclusively would solve my situation. I found multiple things that I needed to bring together into a unified version to solve the problem that I was having in my life. So what now? Well, I have been fascinated with triangles ever since I've started working as a security engineer and seeing more of how devices are built. I always find that 3 is better than 2 and better than 1. 3 is kind of a number that feels familiar to me. So all problems that I try and solve often end to have a triangle in them as a solution. So one of these things that I found is that I needed to take medical device engineering, add it to digital forensics, and I needed to add in medical forensics into that as well. So meaning I needed to look at the device itself, I needed to look at the data contained on the device, and I needed to look at the clinical and medical things to form a hypothesis of what might be going wrong. This might have been in my head. Luckily for me, it wasn't. So this is the approach that I have to medical device forensics. I use the process of engineering or fault finding, generally to debug a device, to figure out how they work. I can forensically acquire them. These are generally done through UART, JTAG. Sometimes we can do this over the network by accessing the device and using the inherent Linux commands to dump out the data, DD, for example. Sometimes we have to do memory, acquisitions. It depends. And this is a term that if you're within SANS, it depends is a thing you know. It's a term we use in forensics. But for my purpose, my device, I was able to get the test results from the technologist that interacted with the device. Because let's face it, interacting with the device myself that's within my body, keeping my heart beating, would probably not have been the smartest idea. And I try and make little to no stupid mistakes, even though I'm human. But yeah, that was not one I was willing to risk. So in terms of that, I used the medical technologist to help me test and debug the device. But I found that there was not enough data for me to actually create a digital forensics timeline. I wanted to have a pivot point and I wanted to have data and I wanted to have metadata. Well, an embedded device doesn't work like that. Simply, it does not work that way. So I knew that this was not going to be applicable as it stands. Yet again, I've run into a wall and I had to put that on ice. Then I decided to start looking at the clinical and medical side. But let's get into where it gets really interesting. I'm going to take you guys literally through every step that I did in dealing with this problem of solving both my device, why it's happening, what is happening, as well as medically proofing that it was happening. So let's try and find what is physically wrong with my device. We are going to apply medical device engineering. This is literally step one in whenever I deal with any medical device. This might even entail going to do some intelligence gathering online. Go Google and find the manuals on these devices. Understand how they work. I needed to do that. So I went and I deep dived into every manual I could find for my device. I learned what every function means. I learned what every treatment means. I learned the errors. I learned how it communicates. I learned how it functions. I wanted to know what was keeping my heart beating or not. And sometimes it feels like some strange voodoo magic that's occurring. Until I've actually seen what it does and understood what it did, I never knew the great power that this little device holds. But let's face it, medical devices are not built with forensics in mind. Some of them, not all of them, are not even built with security in mind. But I'm going to tell you an interesting story before I start. When I started at Medtronic, I walked in and I demanded the way that any patient does, that I wanted, encryption, username and passwords. I wanted everything but the kitchen sink for my medical device. And I remember one of the firmware engineers looking over to me and saying, well, so you're getting a new device every 3 years. And I was very shocked at this because I could not understand why this would even be a thing. Well, security has a cost, and it doesn't mean a financial cost. It has a battery and CPU cost. And who's the person that inevitably will cover that cost? Not the manufacturer, not the doctor, the patient, the person that needs to be cut open and receive a new device. And at that point, I realized that we had to be smart in how we build these devices. We need to be aware of what the constraints are, and we need to work within those constraints. So we did extensive tests. These are tests where we actually stress the device and we push for it to work and sense. And it has a bunch of self-tests that it does. And this is what we noticed. When we conducted the lead check, there was a big differential between the impedance of these leads. And it showed us that the thresholds were being measured wrongly. This gave us a clue as to something wasn't right, quite correct with the leads. On the other hand, the device tested perfectly, yet showed that I was never using it. But this is not conclusive enough evidence for a doctor to motivate to your insurance company that you can get a new device. Except for that, leads are designed to stay in your body for a long period of time. At this stage, you need to realize that my leads were in my body for 18 years at that point. Or I could be doing my math wrong, but it's about between 12 and 18 years. That's a very long time. Now, the leads go in your main arteries and they connect to your heart, where they sense what electrical activity is happening or the lack thereof. They do attach to your heart, because that's where they live and breed, and there's scar tissue. So generally, we don't try and actually pull out leads. So we had a small inclination that something wasn't wrong, but according to the technologist, the device was absolutely testing perfectly. So the findings from my debugging was that my device said I was not using it. It passed all the self-tests. The device could be programmed and it was responsive. Because what's one of the things that they do when you go into a doctor's room is they actually start pacing your heart to see how you are responding and how the device is responding. So they make it beat faster, slower. It's not a very nice process, but it gives you an idea that your device is doing what it should. So for all technical purposes, my test passed with flying colors with some minor issues. Still nothing that would lead us to believe that it was not doing what it should be doing. So as I said, in November and December, I was resuscitated twice, was hospitalized 3 times. I fainted 7 times in those months, was referred to a psychologist. But as a patient, I knew that something was not right. I knew that my life had changed from where it was to not having a life at all. There is something to be said for when you are fighting for your life. There's a different instinct that, that's the fight or flight. And at this point, I knew that I needed to do this myself. I needed to find something else. So this is where lethal forensicating saved my life, and I was able to unbreak the mystery that was my heart. Now I know there's a lot of cheesy catchphrases here. If that's not bad enough, I might even tell a couple of jokes later on. My dad jokes are absolutely the worst. So I knew that I could not trust anything that we pulled from my device at this point. I needed to consider alternate data sources. I literally went from trusting explicitly in my device to not trusting it at all. I needed to convince a cardiologist that they needed to replace the device and that I was not crazy. So I remember sitting down and thinking, well, how would I do this? I'm always told, follow the data. Well, what data can I have that supports my heart? That's not my device. And this is where digital forensics came in. I had a wearable. Currently, I have 2 wearables on my arms because I'm busy forensically analyzing the Android and the Apple Health Kit. But I had an Apple, iWatch that I never took off. So I started researching to know what data was contained on this device, because it was a device that would send me notifications to my iPhone if my heart rate was too high or too low. So surely this data should be stored. Now, obviously, I didn't want to deconstruct and break my device, so I needed to consider forensically how I would get the data. But it also dawned on me that the days that I was resuscitated, I had my iWatch on. It's not something I take off of you. So surely there must be data. So I started talking to people because I needed to get access to the data. I needed to pull it off. I needed to examine it, and then I needed to reconstruct the timeline. This is something we do generally. So what I did was I downloaded my data through my Apple Health Kit. Nothing sophisticated, nothing difficult. I just wanted to do it the quick and dirty way so that I can get to the data. This gave me an XML file that contained a whole host of health information. There's an awesome script, parsehealth.py, that you can use. It's a Python script that actually parses this in a comma-separated file. And that gives me the ability to use what I consider the best forensic tool, after the human brain, is Excel, so that I could look at the data. One of the core things that I learned through my time as a forensics person is that the data never lies unless it's been tampered with, but even that leaves data. So I needed to know what this data is, and perhaps it could support the hypothesis that I'm crazy and that everything's in my head, but just maybe it might tell me what was going on with my heart. So this is the duration where my heart rate was fairly standard. And this was the period starting up in November. So as you can see, my heart rate generally, my normal, paced rate is between 60 and 65. So the data that I was looking at was specifically the type identifier heart rate. This is done so often that it gave me so much data to work from, and it gave me history data, it gave me legacy data that's very old. So I was able to tell that for some days, prior to the events that went wrong, my device was still functioning and pacing as it should, although it said that it wasn't pacing or being used at all. I could see that it was. But then I also started noticing a pattern from about the 2nd of November. And these were the dates that I started feeling ill, and I would feel my heart, what I call a flutter. It feels like a butterfly flapping its wings. That's generally fibrillation that's occurring, and my heart rate would go from approximately 90 straight up to 147. There are some scarier rates, but I chose to not put those in for you because it gets a little bit hectic when it reaches 189. But now I knew that my heart rate was not being dealt with, because if that was the case, when it shoots up, it would receive a shock, which you would see substantial slowing down, and I would be able to note that. But consistently, my heart rate was still maintaining this rhythm, this fast rate. What happens to a patient when your heart rate is exceptionally fast? You don't maintain a positive blood pressure and you lose consciousness. So now I've established that my pacer was working fine on the 1st of November. 2nd of November, things started going slightly wrong. And then things started going really wrong. From about the 6th of November, my heart rate started plummeting. And I didn't start plummeting low levels. We are talking about heart rates dropping down to 41. Now, this is generally when you will have what is called bradycardia, which leads to a 3rd-degree heart block. Now, a 3rd-degree heart block from the perspective medically is the one side, the atrium and the ventricle, start contracting on their own, not in rhythm, not in sync. And somewhere between these two, the electrical currents go lost. So you end up with not sustaining a heartbeat, which leads to the eventuality the heart stops, which is called the 3rd degree or the complete heart block. And this is predominantly led or followed from bradycardia, which is a very slow heartbeat. So I now had an indication forensically that the data suggests to me that my heart rate was behaving fine, my device was fine, and then from the 2nd of November, things started going wrong. Just to give you an idea, on the 13th was when I was resuscitated the first time. That day was a specifically very hard day for me because it came out of nowhere. I was functioning fine, was a little bit tired, and I collapsed. Thankfully, I collapsed in the emergency room because I know my body well enough to visit the emergency room when needed. So now I started to realize that there was something wrong, and I submitted the data to my doctor. And I got told, but hey, just because you have 70%, of your events showing low, how accurate can an iWatch be? Well, I did the research and I knew that he's a medical practitioner. He would want academic literature. And I found that there are cardiologists that make use of Apple's Health Kit to actually monitor and identify problems with their cardiac patients. It's about a 97% accuracy rate. Now, a medical heart device is generally 99% accurate. So we did the analytics and we translated it back, made adjustments. And I was still suffering from over 60% low heart rates, but no data on the device. This led me to both lose trust in my device as well as the medical system, because no one was believing me. So my evidence was that my threshold was between 60 and 70 normally. According to my doctor, when my heart rate goes over 120 and is not in a sinus rhythm, the ICD would shock me. And this you can see from the data didn't happen. My heart rate remained very high. We also saw that the doctor also told me the threshold for my low heart rate between 50 and 58. This means that if my heart drops to that rate, it would need to actually intervene. We also saw that that was not the case. Okay. But this was still not enough. Thankfully, I got exposed to a new doctor who then decided that we were going to do a very old-fashioned, very cruel test to figure out what was going on. Now, I don't know if some of you have ever heard about a tilt table test. They make you stand at 80 degrees, strap you to a table, and keep you there until you pass out, to determine what exactly happens with your heart rate and to determine how well you can manage to sustain a positive blood pressure. So I knew I needed to now put my medical hat on. Yes, I'm the patient, but I'm also trying to solve this case and figure out what's going on. So I know how my heart should function clinically. Okay. But I needed to figure out if there was a clinical way for us to prove or disprove that the device is working. Okay. I also again needed because one of the things we've established is at this stage, we cannot trust the device. So we did the tilt table test, which is now the third side to medical device forensics, looking at the clinical data or finding additional clinical information. So this was when we started. Okay, it's not a pretty heartbeat. There's some broken beats in between. It's mine though, and it was normal at that point. But then things started to go a little bit haywire. After about 20 minutes of standing, my heart rate absolutely skyrocketed and my blood pressure plummeted. Now it is at this point that the device that I had should have kicked in. As a patient, I'm scared, I'm worried. As a forensicator, I was excited because I could see the data starting to match up. Now, this was probably one of the most boring tests I've ever been part of medically at all. You literally stand for an hour. No one talks at you, no one looks at you. And if you know me, I like to chat. I like to joke. Every time I did this, I would get a stern, talking to from the doctor that I'm not allowed to do that. But it was also the first time that I literally started vibrating while standing, trying to compose myself and stay awake. Inevitably, I was unsuccessful in fighting against this, but we saw heart rates of 190, 220, and blood pressures of 60/40. And still my device was silent. We now knew that something was not right. As you can see, it's another EKG. That there are situations where the heart stops beating or doesn't beat sufficiently strong enough. So now I had evidence. I was able to go to the doctor that was now the third one and say to him, well, we have an error on the leads. According to the manuals, this could lead to the device not sensing, not pacing, not administering treatment. I knew that the data from my iWatch showed that there was no treatment being administered. When the doctor looked at the clinical or the medical forensics, he established that it wasn't so much only the leads that were failing. He established that the doctor that previously saw me changed the device to a different model, not taking into account the contradictory nature of my disease or my ailments. I have the slow hearts, I have the high heart rate, and I have the no heart rate. And not taking into consideration the device that I might need, but changing it to a new one without what I feel knowing the devices thoroughly. So now we dealt with a situation where I both had the wrong device, I had leads that failed, and I had data that showed that I was nearing a point where I was getting damage to my heart muscle. It was at this point that we made the difficult decision that we would have to remove the whole ecosystem. By this, I mean they physically remove the leads, they physically remove the device. They then replace it with new ones. At this stage, I felt that medical device forensics enabled me to get enough evidence to have a positive outcome. COVID-19 has kind of pushed us into this realm of unknown. During COVID-19, I needed to see, so I got my surgery in January. COVID hit officially end of Feb. Just in time, you might say that I got my new device. But we've gone through a situation where we no longer can walk into a doctor's office and see them, both for their protection and for your own. Medical healthcare has become so inaccessible. If you look at third world countries that are, or even first world countries that are suffering from cyber attacks, this has led to impaired treatment or less access to treatment. You look at hospitals filling up daily and running out of capacity. I know in South Africa, a lot of hospitals have moved to remote monitoring of patients, telehealth, and this has, basically come in and smashed the borders or the boundaries of healthcare. We have had to be creative in the way that we treat patients. We've had to extend our reach into the digital world, whether we are mature enough to do so or not, and we are playing catch up. Now, often this is the case. Unfortunately, some of these devices have been around in a healthcare setting for many years. It's what I refer to as the legacy problem. It is the constantly moving target. Every year, 600,000 new devices are introduced. In ICU, there's typically 15 devices next to a patient's bedside. Most of these are connected to a central station, which is accessed by the devices. Specifically, more so now in COVID, where we need to monitor patients outside their room. So where is the boundary of security? Where does it start? Where does it end? So when we are dealing with forensics, especially medical device forensics, we need to consider what the device's purpose is. It's not security. I know I'm going to get into trouble for this, but these devices, the main functional requirement to these devices are clinical treatment, right? Or monitoring. So I got tired when I started looking at devices forensically, and you're welcome to go look on my blog. There is an extensive walkthrough through a hemodialysis machine. I started looking at what the device is. Then I started looking at what the manual says, and I often find, hard-coded credentials or an IP address or a way that I can communicate with it, a password to put it into debug mode so that I can actually access the data. I looked at the devices to determine what the file system was. And this is important because if I know how the file system looks, I know how my data will be stored. I know how my data reacts when it's deleted. NTFS is very different from FAT. And if you consider that a lot of these devices run VxWorks, BusyBox, some of them run Windows XP, these devices are now being used to give patients treatment from a distance, because physical proximity has become dangerous both for personnel and other patients. So I realized that medical devices will not mature enough for forensics. We needed to consider alternate data sources. There's some data, but there's not mature data. And I realized that that is something that I'm constantly shouting about, yelling about as a patient, as a forensics person. And I realized that just because I don't have it today doesn't mean I cannot build it for the future incidents. Because I realized that some of these devices have FAT16, FAT32, NTFS, and exFAT. This is nothing new for any forensics person. This is one of the first things we learn. One of the devices we looked at had deleted data on it, and I wanted to recover it, and I was able to, it was a FAT16 file system. I was able to rechain the fact using active disk editor, which is one of the things I love to use, and reconstruct the data. These files were .edf files, the European data format, generally used for signal processing and signal data. Now, this was a patient monitor, but I wanted to see if I can determine from file system to data recovery what the clinical view is. And I realized that employing what I knew of forensics by tricking the system, the clinical software that's out there, open source, to read the data, was able to analyze it. But how did I do it? After I recovered and rechained the FAT on the system, I took the data, the forensic, I made a forensic image of it. I then mounted it in Arsenal image mounter, which is something we all know in SANS, but I added it as a removable drive because the clinical software is set to only read and import EDF files from a removable device, because that's the data flow that follows. And this is what the manufacturer also will tell clinical staff to do. The internet's an amazing source of information about medical devices. I was then able to ingest that to see when the patient actually went about removing the mask, what events they had, because this was a sleep apnea machine. I could see where they stopped breathing, where the machine was working. But to get to that data, I had to look at the engineering side of it. How is the device built? I needed to employ my skills from digital forensics to identify the file system I'm dealing with, because it's got firmware that it runs. I needed to determine what was deleted, and I needed to recover them. Then I needed to find a way to clinically view it. So I used what clinicians would use and some trickery, and I got access to the system. So this is the device in question, the ResMed device. Okay. All data is stored on a memory card. Okay. I debugged the machine and realized that there was absolutely no data of worth stored on the physical machine. I forensically acquired the storage drive. I did diagnostics on the data to see that it was working correctly. What I then did is I actually factory reset it, which claims to delete the data, but all it effectively does is overwrites the first byte with E5, because it's a FAT system that then triggers, it has deleted or unallocated. So in this specific one was a FAT32. After I did this, the data was found to be in unallocated space. I used Winx to examine most of the data as well as active disk editor, recovered my files using Active Disk Editor, which led to them actually returning and being useful. So I used what is Arsenal Image Mounter to then mount my forensic image as a removable disk. Oscar is data, is a software that's open source. It's clinical software. It reads the removable drive from the CPAP machine. It saw the data, it ingested the data, and it built a whole clinical timeline for me. Now, yes, this was my dad's machine, and I made him pose under the blankets because my students are actually doing this in practice. And as you can see here, this is how it looks. And it looks pretty much like any other machine, but it's slightly different, right? But what is more importantly is that we are able to forensically acquire the data. We are then able to actually recover the data using digital forensics. We can map out the file system. We know how FAT reacts. We know how it stores data. And yes, this is just a snippet to a very large project, which I am asking other forensicators to help me with, because we need to determine what we need to build going forward. One of the things that I think we can better do on these devices is building the capacity to have logs. Which is one of the shortcomings. But what I lacked in technical logs, I had sufficiently on clinical, because again, the functional requirement for these devices are clinical, medical, not forensics and not security. So again, we need to breach the security with the forensics, with the clinical, and build stronger devices for the future. Now, Oscar showed me a lot of data. It showed me that there was high apnea attempts, events. There was obstructive events when the session started, when the session ended. And this is my dad's data that I'm using. What also it showed me is the files also show me how his machine is set up, that it's calibrated, that it does its self-tests, that it passes its self-tests. But I really lacked logging. And I don't mean log all the things. I think contextual logs add so much. But much like this, going through a similar process that I went through with my own device led us to find that the device was wrong, that the leads needed to be replaced, and I was able to find alternate data sources. With medical devices and healthcare, we are having to find these additional sources to figure out what has happened. Funny story, Sarah Edwards in February, just after my heart surgery, slapped on an iWatch on my wrist, made me run through Bletchley Park so that she could get all the abnormal flags for my EKG. So she also, look at Heather Malik that was dragging the dead body of her husband to determine what effect her watch had. In dealing with medical devices, we need to correlate what the ecosystem looks like versus what devices are available and find additional ways to look at that. We need to look at the engineering information contained on the device. We need to look at the actual data on the device and build the narrative, but we should never exclude the clinical. The devices record more clinical information than anything else. But the future success of medical device forensics lie in the hands of the manufacturer. It lies in the people developing the code or building the hardware to build in the future capabilities. So we need to consider whether or not our data is enough on our devices to debug it. Generally, this answer is yes. Everything we have found thus far leads to where technical fault finding happens. This is a process that developers and engineers go through every day. They need to determine if something breaks within the field, how they're going to fix it. So this data there is, but we need to leverage this for forensics purposes as well. Do we have appropriate logs the way that we would like to forensically have them? Well, not really. When I refer to an audit log to a security or forensics person and I ask that same question to a developer or a systems engineer, I get vastly different answers because it means different things to us. Logs generally talk about debugging and fault finding, but we should be considering building logs that appropriately address forensic concerns. Do we have sufficient forensic evidence to successfully do an investigation? Generally, it's limited. You need additional data sources to strengthen your investigation, but it also depends from device to device. Some devices run XP, for example, X-ray machines or MRI machines. They generally hold more information. When you look at cardiac programmers, they might contain other information. You have devices running Android. Again, those have different device evidence. We need more people doing the research and looking at the forensics that currently are there so that we can work towards a future in forensics where we want to be. The other question is, do we have sufficient clinical data to reconstruct the details? More often than so, yes, but again, it depends. And this is where my shout out comes. If we do not have it, we should build it. We should be allowing developers to be trained in security and forensics. We should be instilling these practices into the development phase. We should be developing and building products or medical devices with this in mind. These disciplines should not just be something we slap on at the end, but it should form part of our manufacturing phase. We should ask ourselves, what data do we have and what data we would like to have if something goes wrong. We need to realize that some of these devices last for years, more than 10 years. Inevitably, it might not be vulnerable today, but there will come a time in its duration where it will be able to be breached. We should build in the capacity to do DFIR now. We should consider a hybrid approach. We should employ medical device engineering, digital forensics, and medical forensics so that we can adequately establish the state of the device, the state of the data, and the state of the patient. It's the trifecta of observability. It's to debug, to preserve, to examine, and to analyze, and to determine the clinical information surrounding events which have occurred on a medical device. Any questions?
All right, thanks for that great presentation. We do have a couple of questions, but if anyone has any more to submit, please enter them into the questions window. The two that I have are rather long, so I'm just going to put them in the chat window so you can read along as I read them out to the group. It says, it's clear we need devices that continuously provide rich data for live analytics and post-mortem, analytics. However, this clearly has a cost with regards to memory, CPU, and energy. Any idea how to solve this conundrum whilst maintaining a compliant and secure device?
So this is probably the hardest lesson that I learned because there are limitations to the hardware that we design for, and often firmware has reached its limit of what it can do. So we should be considering alternate data sources. So most of these devices do not run singularly. There is a home monitor or there is a central station. So the idea is we need to build the capacity that we can and pull the golden threads through the whole ecosystem or through the devices that follow through. The medical device industry has got a bunch of standards and compliancy issues that it needs to deal with. But inevitably, if you want to remain compliant, it shouldn't be too hard building in these details because you're not doing anything other than what you're doing now, but you're enriching your data or standardizing your data and supplementing it with other data. The compliancy also is so broad, determining on the level of device or class of device, and that's just in the US. That's not even going in considering Europe and Africa. So from my perspective, if you have a device that's embedded, you are limited there for CPU and memory and energy. But there are other devices that it connects to that might be able to have a better data source for you to enrich. So it's basically establishing where you can enrich and where you cannot.
All right, thank you. This second one I also put in the chat window. Having found the disparity between the iWatch and the heart device and proving out the heart device wasn't working, did you make attempts to address with the cardiologist/heart device manufacturers for all patients with the potential same problems? It would seem your work could be the basis for a new toolkit or service for cardiologists to use.
So that's an excellent question. So yes, I addressed this with the manufacturer, but this was not a manufacturing fault. This was simply something that occurred after a period of time and is something that is known to happen. Initially, I thought it was the device itself, but it was the leads that malfunctioned and it was the cardiologist that made the mistake. But this is something that I'm wanting to push, and this is why I'm doing this webcast and I've been writing a lot, is that this become open source, that this approach becomes something that manufacturers can use, but it also becomes something that medical personnel can use. My doctor has referred a couple of cases to me, but not of the same manufacturer, not entirely the same perspective. But there's a big divide between what we understand and what a cardiologist understands this device to do. It's very hard for them to translate from medical to technology. This is not what they studied. But there is a couple of things that I will be writing up and publishing coming forward of this approach. This is just step one. This is me having the opportunity to say this is my thinking process and how I solve my problems. But yeah, it's welcome to anyone that wants to use it.
Thank you. How do we educate patients or recipients of these devices so they know what's in the range of possible? He said it's similar to the last question. So.
Yeah, so this is tricky. So if you look at the statistics generally of who receives these kind of devices, specifically the cardiac devices, they are between the ages of 75 and 90, or there's a 2% overall that's between 19 and 30, and then a small percentage that's younger. There are some initiatives that are trying to educate patients in terms of what this device can do, especially with technology moving forward, these things becoming more interconnected. Again, it's much like a cell phone that's within your body that can communicate outward. But also attacks on ICDs are perhaps a lot harder and proximity based. Not impossible at all. They're in the realm of possibility. But you need to educate the patient that this device will keep them alive. And the device that I currently have is probably not the most secure device, but as a patient, I did the risk assessment, I ran the numbers, and I made the decision to take the device that would function clinically best and keep me alive best versus the device that is secure. You're never going to have a medical device that's not vulnerable or hackable. Inevitably, these things, it's impossible. We know everything can be hacked. But the clinical sometimes outweighs the technical. So it is a balancing act explaining to patients that your device has the potential to be compromised, but clinically, if you don't have it, you die. It's a very hard conversation. I remember having a conversation with an elderly lady that had a different manufacturer than I have, that had a recall that needed to have the device explanted when they tried to update the firmware, it didn't work. And explaining to her at the age of 77 that she needed to have surgery to remove a device that is faulty and had a remote exploit capability was very hard, and why it failed. So I kind of translated it back to, sometimes you bake a cake and you think it's perfect and you put it in the oven, and when you open the door, you realize that, it's not as good as what it looks, and then you need to start over. But it's a difficult thing. And I think as we move forward, we might see medical personnel or medical technologists starting to take on the role of translating, the binary to the human language, to help bridge the gap. But at this point, I'm pretty sure some of the cardiologists don't even understand advisories that are published for medical devices that are being recalled.
All right, thanks. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Any questions that have not been addressed, you can submit them to q@sans.org. Thank you so much, Veronica, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.